neovascular AMD as well as for vein occlusions, and has undergone certain trials for DME which are completed, and this is basically has tight binding receptors, VEGF receptor 1 and 2, which binds the VEGF very tightly. Along with that, it binds not only the VEGF-A, which is bound by the Avastin and Lucentis, but also binds VEGF-B and placental growth factor. So this is the study I was mentioning to. This is recently reported, and results are out in just towards the end of last year. They showed that aflibercept given every 8 weeks, that means alternate month therapy, is the useful thing about this particular drug, that you could give it every alternate month, but you got to give first 5 months monthly injection. So they also found that safety issues were nearly the same as Lucentis. In fact, what they are saying is that Lucentis and probably aflibercept or VEGF TRAP-I would be approximately the same in outcomes. But it's difficult to say till that study is out. So when you come to strengths of anti-VEGFs and certain limitations, the limitations you all know, there are cardiac events, there are events of stroke, and there can be events of intravitreal injection like hemorrhage or even the dreaded endophthalmitis. But coming to the strengths of injections, ranibizumab has the biggest advantage that it's got a very low molecular weight, it's got a maybe having a higher retinal penetration because it's genetically engineered FC fragment only. It's very less antigenic, so less reaction to this drug. It's got a very short half-life, so maybe beneficial from side effects point of view. The bevacizumab or Avastin, popularly known in CAT, which was a neovascular AMD study, showed efficacy is similar, but there's an ongoing drcr.net study for DME comparing ranibizumab, bevacizumab and aflibercept, which study the results would be out probably the end of this year or next year beginning. Finally, the VEGF TRAP-I has a powerful VEGF binding, and its peak efficacy is similar to Lucentis. It inhibits VEGF-B and placental growth factor. It's got a bi-monthly dosing after initial 5 months monthly injections. It's got a similar safety profile as Lucentis. Probably the two drugs are quite similar. So the two important studies which will be important for the anti-VEGF point of view, which are important, is 1:1:1 comparison of ranibizumab, bevacizumab and aflibercept to see which is superior, or are they all equal, or are two of them superior to the third one. And the role of wide field angiography to see the severity of the patient in DME, and does he need for treatment for those peripheral ischemic areas or leaky areas. We recently acquired the Optomap or the wide field angiography at the RP Center AIIMS in New Delhi, and you can see the laser done in the periphery in the patient, but you can see the ischemic areas are still there. So this picture beautifully depicts that we can further treat this patient, and will it help the DME in the center? Some people whom we had recently in Delhi and Mumbai said it does not. But I think a prospective study comparing laser in the periphery where it requires versus no laser for DME would be more appropriate, and that's a wide field angiography study being done. So coming to the last slide, the recommendations for anti-VEGFs for DME, the algorithm would be: control is very important of diabetes, blood pressure and serum lipids. The CORD says diabetes tight control, serum lipids tight control. Use phenofibrates more than statins. Statins are even known to cause cataract. Use high resolution OCT, FFA is the spectral domain OCT, and the fluorescein angiography to determine the areas of leakage as well as other areas which are involving the retina. Non-center involving, there is no problem. You can do laser where the fovea is not involved. But when the fovea is involved, it's a center involving, you must give anti-VEGFs till such time that the center fovea and the surrounding gets dry. That usually takes 6 months. As I said, the deferred treatment is then given with focal laser when the center involving becomes non-center involving. And so if the thickness is too high or the poor anti-VEGF responders, one could, as I said, add laser, but you could switch to intravitreal steroids, and especially in pseudophakic eyes they may be of use, because phakic eyes they may develop cataract and they may require cataract surgery. It's also important to exclude eyes, I still feel, with peripheral non-perfusion which require laser, and wide field angiography may have a role in that. I won't go into the details of the surgery because we have Dr. Manish speaking on that. Thank you very much.
Dr. Atul is nicely covered, and the last slide was extremely important where he summarized all the data which he presented. It's extremely important to remember that systemic control is extremely important. Despite all the anti-VEGFs and lasers and surgery available, the systemic control must be done. Again, one of the important take-home messages for centrally involving diabetic macular edema, the paradigm shift has occurred of changing over from laser to an anti-VEGF, and I'll now request Dr. Sabira Shah, who is, and we welcome you, ma'am. She's from the Joslin Diabetes Center and the Harvard Medical School. Your presentation is here. She'll be talking on novel paradigm for the treatment of diabetic macular edema, and maybe she will touch upon the protocol V, which has come up, and protocol T, which is eventually the data will be published towards the end of this year. Thank you.
This is
your complete presentation. The cases we have not. That is a separate.
Yeah.
This is the one you wanted.
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and privilege to be here to address the distinguished audience. I thank AIOS for inviting me today. I would like to discuss the current and evolving treatment for diabetic macular edema. I have no financial interest. So the 2011, the projected prevalence of, the 2011, 366 million diabetic population was detected, which was much more than the earlier prediction, consisting of 8.3% of the adult world population. 2030, the prediction will rise to more than 51%, consisting of 552 million. So diabetes being an epidemic right now worldwide, we are facing a challenge to detect and to treat diabetic eye disease. The worldwide diabetic retinopathy incidence is 93 million out of all the diabetic patients, 93 million people with diabetic retinopathy of some form. 17 million out of that with proliferative disease and 21 with diabetic macular edema. So we are facing an extremely challenging situation to treat and preserve the vision. Diabetic macular edema is leading cause for the moderate vision loss. As we see here in this slide, this consists of a clinically significant diabetic macular edema consistent with hemorrhages, microaneurysm, hard exudates, and involving the center of the macula. And we see in the OCT, it's a multicystic changes, which causes a significant vision loss. So for the last 25 years, the gold standard for the laser diabetic macular edema is the laser treatment. ETDRS study showed and reported in 1985 that the focal or the grid laser treatment is the gold standard for reducing the moderate vision loss by 50%, which has involved center or threatened to involve the center. It also showed that it causes an occasional moderate visual gain and reduce the retinal thickening after the laser treatment. So DRCR.net is a National Eye Institute funded program in the United States. It is dedicated to multi-center clinical research for diabetic retinopathy, diabetic macular edema, and associated eye disease due to diabetes. I will be briefly discussing Protocol I. So the rationale for the study is to determine if anti-VEGF alone or combined with laser, or if triamcinolone combined with laser result in improved outcome compared with the laser alone for the treatment of diabetic retinopathy, which was shown in ETDRS study. So 3 treatment modalities for macular edema was compared with the focal laser. First is the intravitreal ranibizumab 0.5 milligram with prompt laser within a week. Intravitreal ranibizumab 0.5 milligram, and the laser was deferred for at least half a year, and intravitreal triamcinolone 4 milligrams with prompt laser within a week. The inclusion criteria was to have the visual acuity of 20/32 to 20/230. retinal thickening due to macular edema involving the center, and the central subfield of macular thickening 250 or more micron. The following patients were excluded from the studies: DME treatment within 4 months, panretinal laser treatment within 4 months or anticipated within 6 months, major ocular surgery within 4 months, primary open-angle glaucoma, or treated steroid-induced increased intraocular pressure. Systemic factors like TIA, any cardiac events, uncontrolled hypertension, cerebrovascular accidents, and congestive heart failure was excluded from this study. So all the three groups had equal number of patients, and after the end of the first year, 94% had completed, and 2-year completion was 87%. Mean changes in the visual acuity was seen at 1 year and 2 years. As we see here, that laser treatment and triamcinolone group did much worse than compared to both the arms of the ranibizumab here. Percentage of the patients who had 10 or more letters improvement in the visual acuity definitely showed that both the arms of ranibizumab group did better, and the deferred group did slightly better than the immediate laser treatment compared to the other two groups. 10 or more letter worsening of the visual acuity was noted, which also showed that the ranibizumab group outperformed the other two groups. Now, out of all the patients, pseudophakic eyes was studied, and it showed that the three injection group, to ranibizumab and triamcinolone, did better. So in pseudophakic eye, triamcinolone worked better compared to the phakic eyes. Mean change in the central subfield thickening also shows that at the 1 year mark, all the three injections group did better than the focal group, but at the 2 years triamcinolone did worse. Major ocular events were documented, like endophthalmitis. 5 cases were reported out of 3 were in ranibizumab group and due to injection. Pseudoendophthalmitis was rare. Ocular vascular events were noted. Out of that, 2 were central retinal vein occlusion and 4 were branchial retinal vein occlusion. Vitrectomy and vitreous hemorrhage was more in the sham group, but that was because of the severity of the proliferative disease. Elevated intraocular pressure was obviously more in triamcinolone group compared to all the other groups. Cumulative probability of the cataract surgery over 2 years was 59% in triamcinolone group. Systemic risk factor was low in all the groups. In fact, ranibizumab had a lower incidence of systemic complication. So in summary, intravitreal ranibizumab with prompt laser or deferred laser had a superior visual acuity and OCT outcome compared to the focal treatment alone. 50% of the eyes had substantial improvement, 10 or more letters, and 30% had 15 or more. Substantial visual acuity loss, that is more than 10 letters, were uncommon. Results were similar whether the focal treatment was given starting with the first injection or it was deferred for 24 weeks. Additional ranibizumab and or laser were needed in most of the patients after 2 years, even if the success criteria were met early in the course of treatment. If ranibizumab to be given at it was this study, the data indicates a need for follow-up continuously undergoing this treatment. Diabetes is a chronic disease, and once we achieve a primary outcome with this study, we still need to have the follow-up for long period of time. Intravitreal triamcinolone combined with focal laser did not result in superior visual acuity outcome compared with the laser alone, despite greater reduction in the retinal thickening at 1 year, but not at 2 years compared to laser alone. intravitreal triamcinolone combined with focal laser did not result in superior visual acuity outcome compared with the laser alone, despite greater reduction in retinal thickening at 1 year, but not 2 years. In pseudophakic eyes, triamcinolone group's outcome for visual acuity appeared to be similar magnitude that of 2 ranibizumab group, but is associated with increased intraocular pressure. I would like to thank all my colleagues and staff at the clinical research at the Beetham Eye Institute of Joslin Diabetes Center. Thank you for your attention.
Asked as to what is the utility of these studies, which is it really relevant to my clinical practice? Are these studies meant for the US alone, and we incorporate the data into our clinical practice? We will go on to all these questions in our interactive session where we'll ask Dr. Sabira that what all she's presented, what is the practical utility of this data which she's following in her center. Now I'll request Dr. Vishali to come over and talk on lasers and steroids in the management of diabetic retinopathy.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for the kind invitation. So far we heard that pharmacotherapy, in whatever form you are adding, it's always plus laser, which means pharmacotherapy is an adjuvant to laser treatment. So let's look at why do we not like thermal lasers. We have 2-3 issues with the lasers, and the first and the foremost is we realize that some of the patients we have done a good focal AutoGrid laser, but our macular edema is not going away. Now with the availability of Optos 200 degree visual field, the field available to us and the angiography, we are realizing that neither the degree of the retinal non-perfusion or the perivascular leak were used as a criteria in the ETDRS or diabetic retinopathy study, and these are the markers of the disease pathology which may play an important role in the future management. So it is now being reported more and more that the patients who are having recalcitrant macular edema, it is not due to the failure of the focal laser, it is because there is overwhelming production of VEGF from the untreated areas which are in the periphery, and higher the glycosylated hemoglobin, the higher the areas of DCNPs. So the targeted photocoagulation TRP is becoming additive to the macular treatment. For example, a patient like this, when you see this, you have to manage not only the edema, you have to as well as manage the disease which is coming from the periphery. So ultra-wide field angiography has helped us assessing the amount of the non-perfusion or the ischemia. It has given us a concept of targeted retinal photocoagulation, because this is going to limit the loss of the field vision in the patients, and it is also important when we are managing diabetic macular edema. Another thing why we never liked thermal lasers were because there is no protection to the vital structures, there was no eye tracking, there is no digital documentation, and there is no consistent application. So many times we ended up with the complications like this. Like this is one of the patients I took pictures just a few days ago. You can see somebody has applied laser right in the center, and on the OCT you see a scar, and on adaptive optics showing the cone mosaic shows a total loss of photoreceptor. Now this is a very scary picture to look at. It puts you off the lasers forever. But we know lasers are a necessary evil. So we are now moving towards getting better laser technologies, and one of them is Navilas. Now these are the differences between the conventional and the Navilas. Navina says this is the system which we are now using. You have a monitor here. You can do your fluorescein angiography right there. Or you can simply do the fundus photograph. You can see the image of this patient which we have done the fluorescein angiogram. You mark the areas of the microaneurysms which you want to treat. You also put a barrier to the areas which you want to protect so that the damage which thermal lasers were causing is no longer in your control because you have protected it already. You can't damage it even if you want. This machine is not going to shoot laser here. If you are used to using your OCT guided treatment, you can incorporate OCT images into the system. If you want to protect the disc, you can do that. So you select the areas of the leak, you select the areas of the microaneurysms, you give the targeted treatment as in this patient we have done. So these, you can overlay the fluorescein angiography on your color image. And this is the first patient which I was showing after laser treatment. You can see the laser scar settles and you can see the fovea which is protected. So it has an advantages of giving you clear-cut guidance, protection of vital structures, eye tracking, digital documentation and consistency in the application. Another limitation which put us off the thermal lasers was the collateral tissue injury. Even you have not burnt the fovea, you have put the burns very close to the fovea. 4 years down the line, there will be migration of the burns and they will reach the foveal center. And this is a major problem because of the extension of the scars. So because the pulse which we are using is a millisecond laser pulse in the traditional system which causes the collateral tissue damage. So there has been advances moving on to micropulse, but even with the micropulse, though you will cause the damage to the RPE, you were taking away a plaque of the RPE. So we have moved on to nanosecond pulse laser. So this is the pulse laser which is the sub-threshold laser system and it's called 2RT. It's retina regeneration therapy. We are no longer calling it lasers. They are more of a regeneration therapy. Again, you are avoiding the photoreceptors, you are hitting the deeper tissues, but the chemicals which you are producing even with this laser, they are coming secondarily and producing some damage, though much less damage to photoreceptors. So we have this 2RT which is called photorejuvenation, in which there is no collateral spread at all. It actually stimulates a biological healing process which results in the cellular rejuvenation, and it reverses these impaired transport mechanism. So these are some of the things which are moving on, because we do realize that we are having an epidemic of endophthalmitis in our own country due to inadvertent injections and more injections. So that is not probably the solution for us. We still need lasers and we need to move on to the better systems. This is, I'm avoiding because I don't have too much time. Now coming to the second part of my talk, the steroids. As has been shown very elegantly by Dr. Sabira, the triamcinolone probably does not really help if you are giving it as an adjuvant before doing your laser photocoagulation. But there are certain situations where we would still like to give steroids, and this is nothing, this is what is practical approach where we would use steroids, and this cases mainly deal with the Ozurdex implant, which is the dexamethasone implant. This would be my first indication where you see a lot of subfoveal fluid. You can see here a lot of detachment. And as has been mentioned by our previous speakers, you would like to do a good systemic control and combine it with steroids, and I would prefer Ozurdex because of different reasons, including the control of the IOP, which is much better here. So this is at 1 week. You can see the thickness coming down from 1266 to 847, and at 2 months. And this is the second indication. You have a recalcitrant diabetic macular edema. You have given anti-VEGF, you have treated the peripheral ischemia, you have controlled, but still you have the macular edema, and we know it is multifactorial in etiology. And you have some inflammatory cytokines other than VEGF playing a role. So try steroids, and this is the patient who has received everything but responds to an injection of dexamethasone. The third indication is the top panel shows before vitrectomy. You have done a good vitrectomy, but you have a persistent CME, serous detachment. So some of these situations, the steroid work because you have the inflammation combined because of the surgical insult, besides the leaking microaneurysms, which you may do residual laser. This is the same patient before and 3 weeks post-injection showing the restoration. My fourth indication would be during the surgical intervention. Manish is going to talk more about it. But you can see this is a traditional patient we do the vitrectomy for because it is a tractional variety of macular edema. But we also understand this is 3 days post-operative and this is 3 months later. It takes time for the macular edema to go away once you have done surgery. Now I have started giving implant at the end of the surgery. You can see the example of here. You have this patient which has a tractional variety of macular edema. This is before surgery. This is post-op day 3. You can still see the retina is settling down. This is 1 week. And this is 2 weeks post-op. It helps in the early visual rehabilitation after surgery. And this is the last indication for me is pre-cataract surgery. Dr. Grewal will be talking about it, but we do inject, and we have published this in ophthalmology, that if you inject Ozurdex implant before surgery, the progression of the diabetic retinopathy, you can significantly reduce after cataract surgery. So to conclude, the few things which are in the pipeline are the treatment, which are being happening actually, is the treatment of the peripheral retina, moving more towards the targeted laser treatment, retinal rejuvenation therapy, and steroids only in this select solution. Thank you very much, Ajay, once again for your kind invitation.
Shall we just stay there for a second? What is the cost of Navilas laser and what is the cost of 2RT laser? Cost.
Cost of Ozurdex?
No, not cost of Ozurdex. The Navilas laser?
Navilas is, I think, 60,000 euros, but
and
I may
the
be wrong.
2RT laser?
That is more.
Much more. So we'll be coming back to you in the interactive
But
session.
these
we have on one side a center involving macular edema with injections versus Navilas laser and 2RT laser with a center involving macular edema. We'd like to have your opinion
But
on
actually,
this.
I'm sure these costs do keep coming
Right,
down
sure.
with more and more
We
users.
will discuss during the interactive
Yeah, sure.
session. So I'll now invite Dr. Manish Nagpal, whom all of you know for his fantastic videos. He'll be talking on surgery for diabetic macular edema.
Thank you, Ajay, for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be amongst all of you. We've heard some amazing talks on the diabetic maculopathy, diabetic retinopathy, and all these new concepts which are coming in relation to the lasers as well as the advances. I'll just briefly take you over some of the surgical indications for diabetic macular edema. These are my financial disclosures. The gross indications for surgery where the diabetic macular edema is concerned is in case you have a subhyaloid hemorrhage which is blocking the macula, you cannot assess and you need to do a surgery for that. Apart from that, you either have a vitreomacular traction, which is a mechanical condition, a thick hyaloid causing a traction, or a epiretinal membrane, or it could be a chronic non-responsive edema of some sort that would be an indication for surgery. So when you talk of a subhyaloid hemorrhage, basically you need to clear the media. So there you just identify the plane of the hyaloid, remove all the liquefied blood which is underlying the hyaloid, and then identify all the bleeders, and which allows you to assess the macula, and you could either give an injection or lasers depending on whatever the macular underlying pathology is about. And also control the PDR component by doing a PRP as well as diathermizing the bleeders as we identify them. Sometimes the identification of the hyaloid can be a problem, like a case like this, again a subhyaloid hemorrhage, and after clearing the vitreous, we go and identify the hyaloid and start to peel, but you can see that a sheet moves and looks like the hyaloid, but it's actually just splitting the cortical vitreous, and it's not the true hyaloid because the underlying tissue is still encompassed by the true hyaloid which is there. So after that you clear up some more vitreous and come back and identify the tooth plane, and then you can see that the underlying blood gets liquefied and becomes accessible to your cutter, and then you can remove the blood and then identify what's happening on the macula beneath. You can see there is edema here, there is some strias which suggest there has been a chronicity of this blood lying there and has caused some stress on the hyaloid leading to these strias over there. So now once you have ruled out these mechanical indications and you've identified on the OCT that there is no thick hyaloid, it's only an unresponsive edema, you also need to rule out ischemic maculopathy before you do a surgical maneuver for chronic non-responders of some sort. So for that, I think the best way to look at is angiography. You look at the capillary non-perfusion zones or the foveal avascular zone more importantly, and you can identify whether it's healthy or not. And if there is a gross ischemia, then of course no matter what surgery you do or you think it's a chronic non-responsive edema, it will not help that indication. So one must be clear that what you're tackling is either a traction based situation or a true non-responder. So if you have a traction, you go ahead and remove the traction. It could be a simple vitreomacular traction which can be removed, or it could be these spanning sheets of hyaloid or membranes which could be there, which today with the new generation of cutters we can go and easily cut using the cutter instead of trying to use the forceps and peeling these situations. These are just some examples of the spanning tractions and epiretinal membranes which are coming with a long-standing duration of these proliferations and sheets which come up. So one could use multiple maneuvers either with the use of a cutter itself or use adjunct forceps and to remove the membranes which are spanning in these areas, and then free the macula from any kind of underlying traction which is there. So these are some examples of traction which have been relieved with the surgical indications. This is again showing you a case where there is a very gross traction just temporal to the fovea. There is some thick tissue which is adherent temporal to the fovea apart from some of the other proliferations. So your aim is to free the macula from the traction, and you first take care of all the peripheral areas which are adherent to the hyaloid as well as the proliferations, and once you slowly segment them, relieve them of the traction which they cause by just their presence as in a bridging traction, and wherever there is a bleeding you need to go and stop it and control it. So here you see that after removing all that traction, because there was a stiff adhesion here, we also try and remove the ILM from this area because it would also help relieve some of the traction which has been there because of the chronicity of that membrane which was present at that stage. So once you have a high mag view, you can know if you need to do anything more or not in these situations. This is again a case where there is spanning traction over the macula, and here after cutting some of the peripheral areas of adhesions, you come into the central part, and here we use the technique of the proportional reflux where the cutter expels some of the fluid and helps you create planes between the retina and the underlying retina and the membrane overlying. So here you see that we've insinuated the cutter port between the retina and the membrane and then press the proportional reflux which allows some fluid to come out and create a plane very passively. You can see some egress of this tissue which has come from the tubings, which tells you that we are pressing on the foot switch with proportional reflux. So it very passively allows you to create planes just using the cutter instead of using any other instruments. So slowly you can keep on negotiating that and create small segmented areas and then take them away and just keep small stumps which can be diathermized and removed eventually. And then, as we said, that the non-traction based cystoid edema which is not responding to that, surgery is done for that also, and many times we might not be able to pick up a very spanning attached membrane. While when you are working on a HIMAC during surgery, you can actually see that there is a membrane sheet which sometimes, just because the foveal contour is not disturbed too much, we don't realize there is a membrane over it. But on surgery, you can go and identify these membranes and remove, and at times the edema would respond. And at the end of these surgeries, it's a good thing to add an anti-VEGF or an Ozurdex, whatever one feels comfortable, because the edema would finally respond after you remove the mechanical traction with one of these modalities. This is a very chronic cystoid edema which has led to a small hole in the center, and here as you see, there is some hyaloidal adhesions which are also there. So again, very carefully so as not to increase the size of the hole, because it's very brittle, very friable retina because of the chronicity which is there in this case, and one has to be careful with such cases. They will not gain too much vision, but the relief of traction would lead to a decrease in the overall scotoma in these cases. And lastly, again a case of a chronic non-responsive edema. You can see how extensively this patient has been lasered and has been complaining of visual loss, and you see this striations of a membrane which is spanning over the foveal area. And the patient has been lasered very often in the past, but obviously his main problem has now come out of this central visual distortion because of being a non-responder. So there's a thick membrane which has come off, and after that we identify the underlying ILM which is thickened also, and remove that. So first the membrane comes off, and then the ILM, and at the end of surgery one would give an injection to help reduce the bulk of edema in these cases. So these are just a few examples of surgical indications for diabetic macular edema. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Manish. We'll come back to you once again once the last talk is over. I'll now invite Dr. Grewal to talk on diabetic retinopathy and cataract. Thanks, Manish.
Thank you, Dr. Ajay. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, having seen all that is happening to the retina and diabetic retinopathy, all these cases are going to develop cataract. The incidence of diabetes is increasing, the duration of the diabetes, since their longevity is increasing, it is increasing, and the incidence of cataract is much more in diabetic than in the general population. And even in general practice, 20% of the cases that we operate for cataract have diabetes. And the cataract in these cases reduces the visual acuity, it interferes with adequate examination of the retina, and it makes retinal photocoagulation difficult. And the challenges of cataract surgery in diabetics are development or worsening of the macular edema, the progression of diabetic retinopathy, sometimes anterior segment changes, and increased chances of uveitis in the post-op period. The development and progression of macular edema in diabetics after cataract surgery has been estimated to be approximately 20 to 50%, and diabetic retinopathy progression and macular edema progression after surgery are the main reasons for decrease in vision or poor recovery of vision, and have been the focus of the research as been mentioned in the various research projects earlier. Phacoemulsification with a foldable IOL affects the blood-aqueous barrier more severely in diabetic than in non-diabetics, and it has been shown that the level of the VEGF is maximum at day 1 after cataract surgery and comes back to normal after 1 month of surgery. And the poor visual outcome of surgery are very strongly associated with the duration of the diabetes and preoperative status of the diabetic retinopathy, and it is mainly due to the macular edema. And the main cause of poor vision after lens surgery were complications of the proliferative diabetic retinopathy. This was from the ETR-DRS study. And the diabetic patients undergoing phacoemulsification appear to have a doubling of diabetic retinopathy progression at 1 year interval, and uncomplicated phacoemulsification does not cause acceleration of diabetic retina post-operatively, and any progression is probably due to the natural history of the disease. Now, the patient with different stages of diabetic retinopathy or different stages of the macular edema may be associated with cataract. The intervention will depend upon the stage of the diabetic retinopathy and the extent of the cataract. If the clarity of the lens or the media permits, then you will be treating the diabetic macular edema first. Otherwise, you will go ahead with the cataract surgery and immediately in the posterior period put your attention towards the macula. The preoperative workup, this is a case who had a well-controlled diabetes. His lipid profile was normal, he was not lasered, and he was operated elsewhere, and when he came he had a profound loss of vision, and this is how the retina looked after. Now, it is very important that preoperatively all cases who are undergoing cataract surgery, let your retina surgeon have a look at the retina and clear the case for you for cataract surgery. So a comprehensive preoperative workup should be an integral and compulsory part before you operate the cases. This is another case who was metabolically well controlled. The preoperative visual acuity was 612. He had a bilateral cataract surgery with a lens implant in both the eyes within a period of 2 weeks, and when he presented, his vision had gone down to 636 and gross macular edema in both the eyes. Now this is the case where the attention was not paid to handle or take care of the macular changes before he was taken up for cataract surgery. A situation like this, patient has had changes in the macula, take care of those changes, if need be laser depending upon whatever decision you are going to take care of the macula first and then go ahead with the cataract surgery. This is a case showing changes in the macula. Fluorescein angiography shows changes. He had a laser photocoagulation done. 3 months later, the changes are regressed, and now is the time when this patient can be taken up for surgery. So the focal laser treatment should be done before undertaking the patient for cataract surgery if the media permits. Otherwise, go ahead with the cataract surgery and let your retina surgeon take care of the changes in the post-op period. This is a case who had OCT. As you can see in the lower picture, you can see the changes in the foveal area. He had a pre-op injection Avastin, following which phacoemulsification was done, and 3 months later the macula is in good condition with patient having good visual acuity. This is a 57-year-old patient, and the pre-operative visual acuity was 624. Right eye underwent phacoemulsification. Right eye had injection Avastin and surgery. The changes, you can see the macular edema has reduced quite a bit, whereas in the left eye only phaco was done, the injection was not given, and you can see in the post-op period the visual acuity is also poor and the macular edema is still persisting. So macular edema after cataract surgery in eyes without preoperative central involved retinal macular edema also need equal attention, same as in a center involving macular edema. So even if the central is not involved, these changes should be taken care of before the patients are taken up for surgery. And non-central diabetic macular edema should be managed first, depending upon how you plan to treat before you take the case for the cataract surgery. And use of anti-VEGF prior to cataract surgery is justified and should be followed up with the macular laser if required. The pre-operative, there are a number of studies which show that the pre-operative anti-VEGF reduces frequency and severity of the post-operative diabetic macular edema. This is case again who had an intra-op VEGF injection followed by a focal laser treatment, and post-laser 3 months later he was doing fine with the macula normal. Now this is a case, 66-year-old person coming with poor vision and cataract, and fluorescein angiography shows that there is a macular ischemia. So this case has cataract, vision is 660, has ischemic maculopathy, and patient now in this situation he has gone ahead with the cataract surgery, but the visual acuity has improved based to 618. So this case shows that a pre-operative counseling should be done to give a realistic visual outcome to the patient, so that they are aware that because of changes in the retina, ischemic nature of the macula, they are not likely to improve the vision, and they should be aware of it. This is another case where the media was very hazy to do the adequate treatment. The cataract surgery was done, and in the post-op period the laser was done. So that is another approach where if the cataract is to an extent where you cannot assess the retina properly, in that situation you go ahead with the cataract surgery and then take care of the retina issue. Now this is again a case with macular edema and injection Avastin and improving and remaining same after the cataract surgery. So these anti-VEGF, they have a very good role, and the literature shows that they have a great effect. The incidence in this study is, the difference in the incidence is between 5% and 50%, which is a lot. In this study with ranibizumab, the difference in changes is 22% and 3%. So this approach of using anti-VEGF before cataract surgery has really improved the post-op results after cataract surgery and reduced number of cases who have a poor vision later on. This is a case who presented with changes. Already a PRP had been done. He has changes in both the eyes. Now this case had a fluorescein angiography, showed diffuse changes, and he had a laser done. The vision improved quite a bit, and then he was on antistatins also. And then he presents with 3 months later, he shows that there is a great improvement. On a follow-up, then he developed neovascularization, and his visual acuity still was 6/24, 8 months after the follow-up. He developed neovascularization, for which PRP was done, and at 15 months follow-up, he developed cataract, posterior subcapsular cataract in both the eyes, and then he was taken up for cataract surgery. And with the pre-operative proper management, he did fine. His proliferative changes were controlled, and he had a good vision. In these cases, a good systemic control, use of anti-VEGF, grid laser and lipid-lowering drugs help a lot. And once good metabolic is controlled, only then you should go in for the cataract surgery. And for PRP, you should wait for some time after PRP before you take up these cases for cataract surgery. This is a case showing that the Avastin is much more effective in these cases than injection Kenacort, which now we are not using at all because of its complications. Another drug which shows some promise is Nipafinac. It should be used for 90 days after the surgery, and in this trial, in this paper, it shows that it is effective in controlling macular edema in a statistically significant way. So similarly, another report which recommends Nipafinac for 90 days, and one report which says that even ketorolac is effective in reducing the incidence of macular edema. So in diabetes and cataract, the key to better visual outcome depends on the pre-op complete retinal evaluation, including dilated fundus examination, investigation, OCT, FFA, which is done by your retinal counterpart. You need to take decisions regarding the need for pre-operative laser, need for pre-op, intra-op, anti-VEGF, any other adjuvant therapy which is needed. Then the problems associated with the surgery, it has to be a good, perfect surgery with experienced surgeon. Now with most of the lenses being the acrylic lenses, the choice of the lens is not that issue, but robo laser or femtocataract is the way to go in these cases, because the amount of the phaco power used is minimum and the reaction in the post-op period is much less. And then the post-op management of diabetic retinopathy, and needless to say that the systemic control has to be very good in these cases. Can I take a few minutes, sir? Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Just stay there. We have about 10 minutes for a very small discussion because we have to wind up before that. We'll go on to what you said, Dr. Grewal, is that because most of the people here would be interested in how do we handle cataract associated with diabetic macular edema. Now, what Dr. Grewal has proposed that we should give anti-VEGF. What is your decision that whether it should be given a few days before, on the day of surgery, or as Dr. Vishali said, you can do a cataract and pars plana vitrectomy and give an Ozurdex implant at the end of the... I'd like a quick opinion from all of you.
I would like to give Avastin at least 2 to 3 weeks before doing the cataract surgery, unless the patient is... there are situations where you can use it at the table also. Both the options are there.
Excuse me, one question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think
if long-term, sorry for Dr. Grewal, if long-term effect of Nipafinac and ketorolac is good for 90 days, then why do you need to give pre-op Avastin, which you can probably avoid?
No, that study with Nipafenec basically was trying to...
No, I am asking.
Yeah,
let him answer, please.
Yeah, if a case has a pre-existing macular edema, then you are going to use the Avastin either pre-operatively or during the surgery. In those cases who are diabetic, who are at risk of developing macular edema post-op, they do not have a pre-existing edema. In those cases, after the cataract surgery, you should be using Nipafenec for 90 days as compared to normal cataract cases without diabetes where you don't use it for that long.
Dr. Atul, and quickly one liner.
Pardon?
I said if you can quickly tell whether you propagate use of Avastin before cataract surgery in
Yes.
association with diabetic macular edema.
I definitely do, and I think a week, Dr. Grewal is absolutely right, about 2 3 weeks, but they say the anti-VEGF effect is maximum in 7 to 10 days. So
Like,
maybe
about a week before that.
week before should
Anybody
be...
differs with this opinion, or everybody agrees that we should do that? Yeah, Manish?
I mean, I would rather advise to do it along with the cataract. Why have two interventions? I mean, your aim is that the edema which is existing gets treated to some extent, and some new edema due to the cataract surgery doesn't worsen. So if you give it along with the surgery, you are saving one procedure, and probably you'll have the same effect after a month of cataract surgery, whether you give it 1 week before or
Okay. Dr. Sabir and Dr. Vishali?
I think I agree with Manish. I would select the cases. If the patient has a very active proliferative disease,
Can you be closer to the mic? I don't think people can hear you.
hello.
Yeah.
So I would select the cases if the patient has a very active diabetic retinopathy along with macular edema, or patient has a rubeosis of the iris. I would inject a week before with very minimal macular changes, or there is a history of macular edema in the other eye after the cataract surgery. I think it is okay to do it at the time of surgery. As Dr. Nagpal said, why to put him through two procedures? So we can do that way. But if there is a large cystic edema, history of previous cataract surgery in the other eye, and macular edema worsening, I would definitely do it a week before.
Thank you, Vishali.
Yeah, I agree. For me, if the diabetes is very severe, I will not plan him only for cataract surgery. I would rather do the complete combined vitrectomy.
No, but we are talking about cataract surgery with the diabetic macular edema as...
I would do it at the time of cataract surgery, because the maximum impact of the inflammatory mediators comes in 4 to 6 weeks after the cataract surgery.
Okay, so would you inject anti-VEGF,
So
or would
if
you
you are
inject...
giving it prophylactic at the time of cataract surgery, if you are going to manage the pre-existing one, then of course 1 week before cataract
No,
surgery.
but would you give anti-VEGF or would you give Ozurdex?
I would prefer Ozurdex to prevent mainly the Irvine gas kind of the edema, because that is not due to VEGF. That is due to inflammatory mediators, cytokines and prostaglandins, which are better taken care of by steroids rather than by. And I prefer Ozurdex because it lasts for at least 2 to 3 months. And you need a maximum anti-inflammation in 4 to 6 weeks, because it begins somewhere 2 weeks and 6 weeks. That's the time when CME comes. So if you want your steroids in place, I would give it during the time of the phaco.
Do you have any ways of finding out if this patient is a steroid responder or not?
We used to do all those things, giving a topical steroid trial many years ago. Right now we are not doing. But if the patient has a healthy disc and no history of IOP elevation beyond 22 millimeter mercury, we give. And we have used about 270 Ozurdex implant, and the rise of intraocular pressure is about 10 to 12%. And generally it doesn't go beyond 28 millimeter mercury, and generally you can control it with 1 or 2
Fine.
topicals.
Thanks. Neeraj, what do you think?
Yeah, depending on the severity of the edema, if large cystoid space is massive edema, preferably injection to be given 1 week prior. If it is mild macular edema, spongy type, maybe at the time of surgery itself you can give.
Yeah, so we have a slight difference between giving Tricort or Ozurdex versus anti-VEGF, but most experts agree that if you have a cataract surgery associated with cystoid macular edema and the patient is undergoing cataract surgery, it's wise to give an anti-VEGF feather at the time of surgery or a week before, and then follow up these patients closely. We'll probably take care of one more situation. This is important. This is the European expert panel. I think the DRCR-V, which is the protocol, is discussing about patients having a visual acuity of less than 20/32. Now, I'll ask Dr. Sabira, in your clinic, where you have a patient coming to you with a macular edema, where the visual acuity is better than 20/32, do you observe these patients or do you inject in these patients?
I think 20/32 is a cutoff at our clinic. You can go either way.
Closer to the mic, please.
The 20/32 vision is a cutoff vision for injection in our clinic. If the patient is severely diabetic, A1C is very high, the level of retinopathy is high, and these are the patient who has a high risk with multiple systemic factors, and in that case I would inject.
Okay. The protocol V, which is now coming up, which is a very good visual acuity protocol, we recently had a talk by Neil Bressler in Delhi, where they said that if you have a visual acuity of better than 20/32, the results are not yet out, but they may consider re-injection if this persists for a fairly long period of time.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
My question is to Dr. Grewal. Would you recommend a specific procedure of cataract in these cases?
No, not specific, but it should be a perfect surgery, so that there is minimum surgical trauma and minimum inflammation induced in the post-op.
So you would recommend phacoemulsification as an indication for surgery here?
Can you repeat the question?
No, sir is asking, I think why he is asking is, would you prefer phacoemulsification versus an extracapsular surgery in diabetics?
I'll prefer to go with femtocataract in these cases.
To reduce the trauma. And any specific lens you would prefer?
No, any single piece acrylic lens, or if you want to use the heparin coated lenses, because there are one or two work on that about the use of heparin or low molecular weight heparin during surgery. It is basically aimed, the cataract surgery should be aimed at reducing the post-op inflammation in whatever ways you can do it. In whatever ways you can maximize the effect, or in whatever ways you can minimize the post-op inflammation. So each and every step you will do accordingly.
And my second question is to Vaishali. How did you compare the decrease of collateral damage between Pascal and the Navy lens?
Sir, we are recently in the preparation of a manuscript between the Pascal and Navilas. We have measured the spot size, and we have measured how much is the increase in the volume, ellipticity, and the size of the spot size. And we have a follow-up only for 6 months. At 6 months, the Navilas is showing much better result in terms of the shape, less extension of the scar compared to the Pascal for PRP. But we need a longer term follow-up to see how these two strategies compare, because Navilas has been with us only for 6 months now. So we do not have a very long-term follow-up.
Does it reduce the time of PRP?
Interestingly, up to 6 months, we did not see any reduction in the spot, because we measured the volume of the scars, and the volume of the scars and the total area which we have calculated has remained the same. It has not really reduced, but it has not increased also, which is encouraging.
No, my question was, does it reduce the time taken to do the PRP?
Yes, definitely. It reduces the time, because you don't have to put a lens if you are doing focal laser. The patient is just sitting there, you come, you take the picture, because there is no white light. It is it's all infrared light, so patient does not see anything. You do the fluorescein, sitting the same, you mark it on the computer, and you shoot laser. It's a very quick procedure. And you don't have to do anything. You just mark it on the computer and it does it for you.
The time is over. I thank you all for coming for the IC. I would appreciate your feedback. As I said in the beginning, you can send it by a smartphone. I thank all my co-experts, faculty on the dais for a wonderful course. I'm sorry we did not have enough time for discussion, but that's the constraint of time all of us have with the ICs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Umang Mathur, for chairing the session. And we'd like to welcome Dr. Arumali Varman from Chennai and Dr. Saurabh Patwardhan from Pune for this afternoon lunch hour session. So on behalf of Apasami Associates, I would like to welcome each one of you and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'll be speaking about the toric IOLs in my practice. Nowadays, we all know that cataract is no more just a surgery to restore vision, but an opportunity to enhance it as well. And it is a fortune that we are ophthalmologists and we can do that. And what is a better way than giving our patient unaided 20/20 experience all time? I'll be speaking about my experience with the toric IOL so far. The residual cylinder, we all know, has profound effect on quality of vision. As you can see here, as the cylinder increases, the quality of vision drastically decreases. More so with more number of cylinder. But it is not so that even with small cylinder, our post-cataract surgical experience for the patient may become from wow to just nice. As you can see here, that just with 0.75 residual cylinder, patient may not be able to see as good as he may get without any cylinder. So let's just think, what is the prevalence of astigmatism of more than 1.25 diopter cylinder in patients who are undergoing cataract surgery? Is it 10%, 20%? No, it is around 30% of our patients who have more than 1.25 diopter cylinder. And if we are really aggressive and think about those who have more than 0.75 cylinder, almost 42% of our patients fall into that category. So almost every other patient requires some kind of management for correcting this kind of astigmatism. And there are different plans to correct that. We have corneal incisions like LRI and opposite clear corneal incisions. We have toric implants, as we will be discussing, and there are corneal ablative procedures. But of course, toric IOLs is the preferred choice because it is least disturbing for the corneal surface. It is there is less regression involved, and there is a better quality of vision which is ensured. And it's always so that adding is always better than subtracting, just like our bank accounts. Goal of my talk is to guide you on how to incorporate this toric IOLs in practice based on my experience. The success of toric IOL implantation depends on three major things. I will be talking more about what we have to start doing in our OPD session to start incorporating more of these IOLs in our practice. First, very important thing that we should start doing is do keratometry of each and every patient at first encounter. Whenever patient walks in your OPD, the first thing he should undergo is a keratometry. Manual keratometry can be done, but it is tedious, so automated keratometry is a better approach. And if keratometric astigmatism is more than one diopter, then reconfirm with any other second instrument. So what is my method? I do first automated keratometer with Topcon, and then I do IOL master if the patient is a cataract candidate. If these two are corroborating, well, fine. Otherwise, I will go ahead with the manual keratometry and topography to just confirm my findings. Getting biometry done before you face a probable cataract surgery patient makes a big difference in surgeon's thinking and decision making. Because whenever there is astigmatism pre-existing, whenever you see the patient, you are always thinking why there is such kind of astigmatism in this patient, whether I should do something during cataract surgery to correct it, and how I am going to plan it. That is a big difference in your thinking when you are facing the patient. Now, as far as biometry goes, we'll think about keratometry first. Different instruments measure different number of points of cornea. Like for example, manual K takes the best 4 points, IOL master measures 6 points, LensStar measures 2 rings of 32 each, and topographer makes almost measures 100 points. But all machines are equally accurate and inaccurate. To what I mean by that is there will be outliers with each system. That means some patient may be giving some erroneous reading with one instrument but may give better reading with other instrument. So why there is such a difference? That is because each instrument measures a different zone of cornea. ILMaster measures the central 2.5 zone. Lenstar measures the 1.65 and 2.63 zone, and there are multiple number of points. Manual K takes a larger 3.2 mm zone, while topographer gives a projected value as the 3 mm circle zone. So which one is better? When I started my toric practice, I went through various literatures, and this is what Dr. Warren Hill had said. In 2008, he was very much emphasizing on manual K only and no other instrument, but later he also shifted to automated keratometry and also ILMaster. So we have to decide our own protocol. So in my case, my protocol is, if ILMaster reading is corroborating with auto K reading, that is with the Topcon machine, then I go ahead with the ILMaster reading. But if there is a discrepancy, then I go ahead with manual keratometry as well as topography, and I find the most repeatable reading and I take it. So my caution is, don't go by ILMaster K reading alone. There will be some problems with these readings. But we don't need always optical biometer or different topographers to start our toric practice. The basic two things which we require is a manual keratometer and automated keratometer, which most of us have. Automated keratometer is more useful for axis measurement, because manual keratometry, though those who are well trained with manual keratometry can pinpointedly take the axis, but it takes more time and it may be technician dependent. But there are problems with keratometry. You have to calibrate the keratometer frequently, at least twice in a year. There will be difference in readings from different machines, so we have to use whatever resources that we have for taking keratometry, and always take readings without putting any drops. The first time the patient comes, if patient has come and he has been put drop, call again patient fresh and then take readings, because it makes a huge difference in keratometry readings. We always take cornea for granted in such cases. Don't forget to examine the cornea on slit lamp, because many times this patient may not be having actually a regular astigmatism, but an irregular one because of dry eyes or abnormal tear film or corneal opacity, or they may be patients who have previously operated for trauma or previous surgery. So anything which tells you that there is a chance that there is an irregular astigmatism on the cornea, stay away from that in that patient from using toric IOLs. Now recently Dr. Koch presented paper where he measured the posterior corneal astigmatism. Now we know that posterior cornea has average against the rule astigmatism of around 0.3 diopter plus minus 0.16. So it adds to the actually measured against the rule astigmatism, and it reduces actually measured with the rule astigmatism. And over the years what happens is that the cornea tends to become more against the rule. Hence, it is better to aim for not for 0 cylinder, but to aim for 0.25 to 0.5 diopter with the rule astigmatism. This is how it is done, that whenever there is a with the rule astigmatism, you slightly undercorrect, but for against the rule astigmatism, you overcorrect by around 0.7 diopter. Now, why we are thinking of this posterior corneal astigmatism now? Because this entity is known since 1890, and that is primarily because IL power measurements are becoming more and more accurate now. In fact, the only problem I have faced so far in toric IL practice is not correction of astigmatism, but the spherical error. So, what are the essentials for starting toric IL practice? Most important thing is get a customized A constant for that particular IL platform. For example, if you are intending to use suprafocal toric lens, then its platform lens, that is suprafocal monofocal lens, you have to use it in 20 to 30 patients. Get your A constant for that particular IOL yourself, so that you get more accurate readings when you are using the toric IOL. This customization can be easily done by using an Excel sheet, which can be found on this site of Dr. Hill, where you get a Haggis formula. You can feed your post-operative patient's data, and it will give you a customized A constant for that particular IOL. Never use a contact A scan, and always use a good calibrated immersion A scan or an optical biometer. Optical biometer is not must. Even a good calibrated immersion A scan is good enough, but you have to calibrate it well. That means you have to compare it with something better, or you can compare it with an optical biometer if it is available in around area. So once you know that this particular immersion A scan is giving accurate reading, you go ahead with that. And get consistently accurate biometry on the platform IL first. Why I am emphasizing more on this A constant is because if patient has emetropic spherical equivalent post-operatively, a little amount of residual astigmatism will not matter. For example, if you can see on the left side, the patient has one diopter cylinder, but the spherical equivalent is 0. So he has much better vision as compared to right eye, where he has got one diopter cylinder, but spherical equivalent is minus 0.5. So obviously he has lesser vision in that eye. So if spherical equivalent is 0, most of the problems of residual astigmatism are gone. Use always the right formula for the axial length, so that you have to use SRKT for your regular cases, but for shorter eyes you always use a optimized Haggis formula or Hoffer-Q formula, and for longer eyes use a Holliday-1 formula. And the underlying thing is optimize. You have to optimize it for your own setup. I will not go to the different techniques where how you have to mark, because the next speaker is going to delve into this. So I will be showing a little video here of my own surgical technique. This thing is hanging. Now, I would like to highlight this particular case first. This is a case of recurrent pterygium. This patient has been operated 10 years back for pterygium, and then he had recurrence. But over 10 years, it has remained same. So I am not going to touch this pterygium because there is a higher chance that it may recur again. But he has got regular corneal astigmatism. That is very important thing. If this patient had irregular corneal astigmatism, I would have thought of removing this pterygium first. But because he has regular corneal astigmatism, I will be using a toric IOL in this case. The preoperative marks you can already see. In most of my cases with premium IOLs, I use a capsulorhexis marker. You must have seen it before also. This is a modified one which is called Patwardhan rhexis marker, which has small knobs on the undersurface so that you can mark the anterior cornea, and then you have to do your rhexis within these marks. So you get a 360-degree overlap over the IOL optic. This is a very good preloaded IOL system which requires nothing to be done, just fill visco over it and close the flaps so that your IOL is ready for injection. It goes through 2.8 mm incision. It can be injected very easily. And then you can see the haptics are quite thicker as compared to other IOLs which might be more stable in the eye. Once IOL is done, most important step is do entire visco wash. You have to go below the IOL, clean the posterior surface of the lens as well, because these hydrophobic lenses are quite tacky and they will stick to the hydrophobic capsule if they are cleaned of visco, so that post-operative rotation is very less. Once you are thoroughly washed the visco from the lens, what you have to do is hydrate all the pores before you start rotating the lens. Many surgeons rotate it while doing IA also. This is what I do. I use a bimanual irrigation or a 25 or 27 gauge cannula, and I use a short Sinskey just to rotate it to its perfect place. And another most important thing, tap the lens down so that it sticks to the posterior capsule and it avoids the anterior shifting of the IOL, which may be noted in some cases. Before removing your irrigation, hydrate all the pores so that anterior chamber shallowing does not occur, and your case is done. And you can see this lens remains perfectly stable even with eye movements. Another simple thing, because I was more emphasizing on the maintenance of the anterior chamber, here I can show you a small little trick to hydrate the incision well. In some cases the incision may not close properly, so what I do, I make a partial thickness wound just above or anterior to the actual incision, and I hydrate that wound so that it sandwiches the actual incision and makes it sealed completely. So now you can see after hydrating this partial thickness wound, the AC deepens and it becomes tight. These important maneuvers are very easy to learn, and you can start doing it in your monofocal practice and then shift to toric IOL practice. Now, what was the main hesitation for me on starting toric IOL implantation? The first thing was cost and reliability. Now, all these two things are well taken care of by Appasamy. So, my only hesitation now is that whether result will be perfect, will there be residual cylinder, whether my patient will be dissatisfied because of the residual cylinder. Even if there is little rotation, suppose later on, or there is a error which is not expected by you, this is a very simple method to correct your toric IOLs. This is a particular website by Dr. Alpins. It is called www.assortAssort.com. You can feed in your toric IL data which you have implanted. You can feed in your post-operative refractive error which you have encountered, and the website it will has its own algorithm, and it will tell you whether you have to rotate this IL anti-clockwise or clockwise, or you have to explant and put a different IL. So it is very easy. Luckily, I have not done this. I didn't require. Always under promise and over deliver. Don't tell the patient that I am going to take care of entire astigmatism. Even if reduction of astigmatism is there, patient will be very happy. Now this is my experience with 16 eyes that I have done with supraphotonic, and I have found excellent rotational stability with this IL, which are comparable with other ILs which are in the market. And there was reduction in mean refractive cylinder from 2.2 mean to 0.65 in the post-operative period. Only one patient of mine had a post-operative refractive cylinder of 1.5 diopter, but he had pre-op cylinder of almost 4.5 diopter, so he was very happy with the results. Rest all 15 eyes had residual cylinder of less than 0.75. Simultaneously, we were using other lenses also, like Acris of IQ Toric, and results I found were comparable with both the lenses. Now, as far as perfection goes, when I searched through different studies, what I found is that there is a mean error in the position of the implanted IL of around 5 degrees in most of the case series. That means even if you do surgery, there are cases which are bang on, or there are few cases which may be having 5 to 8 degrees of rotation as compared to your intended axis. But is it going to make real difference? I will just give you, if suppose your average rotation is say 6 degrees, that means 20 degrees decrease in the toricity correction, because 1 degree there will be 3.3% reduction. So consider a patient who has got pre-op cylinder of 2.25 and which requires a 3-cylinder IOL. Then the residual cylinder will be just 0.45 diopter or 0.5 diopter, which is hardly anything. And if you have got your spherical equivalent correct, that is not going to matter much. So my experience is that patients are quite satisfied with the reduction in astigmatism. But before you start, work more on A constant optimization and accurate biometry. Spherical equivalent closer to plano gives a better visual quality. Don't use contact A scan, so it may be highly accurate in 95% cases. In 5% cases, it may give erroneous results, and that is a big headache. So use either a optical biometer or a good immersion A scan. Both are equivalent according to my study, and use at least 2 methods to do your keratometry. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Patwardhan. I think lots of small points in your presentation which I think are important and we need to discuss. One, I think that everybody needs to remember is that don't take your keratometers for granted. You need to calibrate them. And even a manual keratometer is very easy to calibrate.
Yeah.
There is a little lens that comes, and usually we just see it when we buy the keratometer, and then it lies around in the box somewhere. But that's something that needs to be regularly done. And like you mentioned, I think it's although good to have the optical based or even an auto refractometer doing the keratometry, but even a manual keratometer, if you have a trained person who does it regularly, and if the keratometer is calibrated properly, will give a very good result.
Yeah.
Anything that you changed in your design of the clinic, normally in a lot of busy clinics, the patient comes, you do the clinical examination, you advise cataract surgery based on your slit lamp examination, and then somewhere the patient goes for an A scan and then goes on your OT list.
Correct.
Did you change some flow or something for your...
That's what I mentioned, that whenever the patient comes in OPD, the first thing that you get done is auto keratometry and auto refractometer, and also of course NCT that we routinely do, even before your ophthalmic technician touches the patient. And first thing that my ophthalmic technician does is he does a distant direct ophthalmoscope. If he feels that the patient has some amount of cataract, then he gets IL muster done before even touching the patient.
Right. So when you are examining the patient, you have all this data
everything
with you.
Yeah.
So you know this is a candidate who would benefit from a toric IOL.
Correct.
I think that's an important point, because a lot of times we miss that opportunity.
Right.
And it's too late in your OR when you realize that, okay, this patient has 2 diopters of keratometry difference between the 2 axes, and now you haven't counsel the patient.
Yeah. It is just like preparing for exam, Your patient is going to take your exam. If you are pre-planned, everything is ready on your sheet, you are best to answer his questions or queries on various things.
So that's an important point. And also your point was very well taken that don't just focus on the keratometry. It's also important to know not have a spherical error.
That is true. That is.
So that's important. How does, a lot of us have used the multinational manufactured toric lenses. One of the deterrents to use was the cost.
Cost, correct.
I think for the last almost half a decade know that the toric IULs do work, and they give a pretty good result in the patients who have some astigmatism. So that's quite proven that the hydrophobic lenses with the toric incorporated in it works well. But it was a small percentage of patients in whom you could use. But with the Appasamy lens, are you equally happy with the result? Because now the cost difference is not a deterrent.
Yeah. Now I am quite happy. As I mentioned, the important thing is the A constant optimization. Why we get very good results with most of the multinational is that they have got the data in the ULIP database, while most of the Indian lenses do not have. So you have to customize your own A constant for that particular IOL. So the initial IOLs that I have done with most of the Indian companies had some errors because of there was no customized A constant. Once I got it done, the results were almost equal.
Almost. And the platform, the preloaded lens, is that something you enjoy doing?
I had not used preloaded with this, and it's very easy because it takes most of your headache away. You are not thinking of broken haptics or other things because it's already preloaded, and the one step is less in the surgery.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us, sir. So next I'll invite Dr. Verman, who hails from Chennai and has a big practice in cataract surgery and has been doing a lot of multifocal and the so-called premium lenses and the toric lenses. And it'll be great to hear from him his techniques on how he does these lenses. A lot of people feel that it's something new, it's something different, it's something that you have to really prepare for. And that sometimes is a deterrent for people to use these lenses. But toric lenses is one of those things that you can't really go too wrong. And most patients are going to have a very good result. And it doesn't even have the factor that you often have in multifocals where you may have a good result but the patient is really unhappy. Toric lenses are something that we all can incorporate in our practice. How many sitting here routinely do the toric lenses? Okay, so there are quite a few who are still to start. So this is, we'll have time for questions and...
How many of you have optimized the A constants for different IOLs that you are using and do surgical audit also of your patients?